Hi everyone and welcome to my project. Today we're going to be going over the No Political Enemies Act that was introduced September 18th, 2025 and discussing the information surrounding it. We're going to be spending a fair bit of time talking about the situation leading up to the No Political Enemies Act, and then we're going to talk about the act and how Senator Chris Murphy presented it before talking about the media's response, some class concepts of demagoguery, political polarization, and media framing before wrapping it all up and finishing from there. On September 10th, 2025, political podcaster Charlie Kirk was shot and killed during a rally at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. On September 11th, late-night talk show host Jimmy Kimmel discussed the shooting and President Donald Trump's response, stating, quote, "With all these terrible things happening, you would think our president would at least make an attempt to bring us together, but he didn't. President Obama did, President Biden did, Presidents Bush and Clinton did, President Trump did not," end quote, while flashing images of tweets from the former presidents before moving on to discuss Trump's response. Over the weekend, discourse erupted about the shooter of Charlie Kirk and whether or not he was a Republican or Democrat, and then moving on to discussing his sexuality and whether or not he was transgender. On Monday, September 15th, Kimmel responded saying, quote, "We've hit some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize the kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them," end quote, before shifting to discussing Trump's grief and showing a clip of him getting condolences from a reporter and immediately talking about the construction of the ballroom. Right-wing influencers and the media became outraged at the MAGA gang comment, believing that it wasn't a true representation of shooter Tyler James Robinson's political beliefs and that it was inflammatory remarks from Kimmel. In his third monologue on September 16th, Kimmel discussed Vice President J.D. Vance hosting the Charlie Kirk podcast in an episode after his passing, then going on to state that Vice President Vance's claim that Democrats are more violent than Republicans based on statistics is complete bullshit, and quoted a study that he says, quote, "showed white supremacy and violence from far-right groups is the greatest source of domestic terror and extremist violence in the United States," end quote. September 17th, Brendan Carr, chairman of the FCC, went on a podcast and stated that Jimmy Kimmel should be pulled from the air as media companies are granted by the FCC to report based on public interest, and Kimmel was not acting in public interest. Shortly after, many media groups began to pull out of ABC, saying they wouldn't air Jimmy Kimmel Live anymore because of his comments. ABC announced the same day that they would be indefinitely suspending Jimmy Kimmel Live because of his comments, sparking outrage and cheers from both sides of the political spectrum. The very next day, Senator Chris Murphy and his supporters held a press conference in which they introduced the No Political Enemies Act. The No Political Enemies Act, or the NOPE Act, was introduced by Senator Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, during a press conference where he said, quote, "We are going to be introducing in both the Senate and the House the No Political Enemies Act. This is legislation that makes sure that the law is on the side of free speech and the right to dissent. Now, I wish this legislation weren't necessary, but it is now. Donald Trump right now is instructing his Department of Justice to go on the hunt for his political enemies. Attorney General Bondi has made it clear she is going to arrest people just for speech that she doesn't or the president doesn't agree with," end quote. He then discusses Jimmy Kimmel's suspension, discussing that it's censorship and that it's Donald Trump posturing and going after people he doesn't agree with. Murphy's rhetoric discusses political polarization and the lack of bipartisan leadership as he discusses the division between the left and the right, also leaning into the idea of demagoguery and how it's applicable to both sides of the political spectrum. Many news sources applauded Senator Murphy for standing up to Trump's attack, while others argued that Murphy was sowing dissent and creating more division in the United States. An article posted by the Associated Press stated, quote, "After ABC suspended comedian Jimmy Kimmel's late-night show following a threat from the head of the Federal Communications Commission, Chris Murphy has denounced the Trump administration's threats against political critics and unveiled a bill that would bolster free speech protections against government officials. While the bill is unlikely to gain traction in a Republican-controlled Congress, Chris Murphy harshly criticized the Trump administration for pressuring ABC towards the suspension of Kimmel's show following his comments made on how Republicans were responding to the fatal shooting of Charlie Kirk," end quote. This article uses language like threats, bolster free speech, and harshly criticize the Trump administration, which exemplifies a strength in Murphy's dissent from the administration and paints the image that he's standing up for justice. On the other hand, right-leaning news source Breitbart stated, quote, "The president has called on the Justice Department to go on the hunt for his political enemies, and Attorney General Pam Bondi has threatened to arrest people for speech that she doesn't agree with," Murphy said. He called the alleged political hunt bone-chilling and said new protections must be enacted to protect against the president and others from targeting people and organizations for political speech, end quote. This article uses smaller quotes that can be taken out of context, sprinkling it in with divisive language like alleged and threatened without putting the latter in the context of the larger quote to make it appear like Murphy is using more divisive and harsh rhetoric than he is. Both are good examples of how Murphy's communication is being seen in different lights via media framing. According to author Patricia Roberts Miller, quote, demagoguery is about identity. It says that complicated policy issues can be reduced to a binary of us, good, versus them, bad, end quote. Murphy allows demagoguery to seep into his rhetoric by discussing that Trump is going to move for stronger censorship, stating things like they aren't hiding, which uses rhetoric that separates Murphy's stance from Trump, showing that they're on different sides of the argument, and by allowing the listener to make the choice. Are you on Murphy's side that wants to defend free speech or Trump's side that wants to suppress it? It forces the listener to make the choice and ultimately puts a label on them either way with no room for nuance in the middle. Author Ezra Klein discusses the idea of political polarization. Quote, perhaps the single most important fact about American politics is this. The people who participate are more ideological and more partisan, as well as angrier and more fearful than those who don't. The finding emerges from Pew's massive survey of 10,000 Americans, which concluded 2 years ago that Republicans and Democrats are more divided along ideological lines, and partisan antipathy is deeper and more extensive than at any point in the last 2 decades, end quote. Klein's ideas have only become more solidified in the past few years, seemingly gaining more and more traction as 2025 itself continues to wind down. Chris Murphy's rhetoric can lean into political polarization while also examining it. By mentioning that Pam Bondi has stated she's going after people she doesn't agree with, he brings up the idea that we've reached political polarization through the idea that we truly live in an us versus them mindset in the United States now, and that all we can rely on is attacking one another and painting each side in the worst light possible. Finally, when discussing Murphy's rhetoric, we can rely on the above articles to discuss media framing and how it changes Murphy's rhetorical argument through different lenses. Media framing can be described as, quote, the process whereby communicators act to construct a particular point of view that encourages the facts of a given situation to be viewed in a particular manner, with some facts made more noticeable than others, end quote. Both articles rely on their own framing of words rather than quoting Murphy flat out, which allows bias to be skewed in either direction, which can ultimately hurt support or argument against Murphy's rhetoric because readers don't get a full understanding of what Murphy is trying to state. The Associated Press article doesn't outright quote him, but describes his speech in a way that can make it more middle-leaning so as to draw in a larger number of readers, whereas Breitbart uses specific words from Murphy's speech to draw on an opinion from the reader, neither of which allows Murphy's words and meaning to come through fully, which skews overall understanding of his rhetoric. In conclusion, we can take what we know about the situation and how the media is framing it in order to better understand where the outrage started and how we've moved into the position we're currently in. Although free speech and Jimmy Kimmel seem to be protected right now, it begs the question of who's going to be removed from the air next. Will Saturday Night Live go too far, or will it be Jimmy Fallon? Although it's a scary time we live in, if we just take in what's being presented to us and think critically based on what we've learned in class, we should be able to make it through all right. Thanks so much for sticking with me, and I hope you learned a little bit more about the situation.